Some people don't make noise when they change your life. They just walk in, sit down, and remind you who you are. Tasha Melrose didn't know the man in the old leather jacket was Harrison Ford. She didn't care. All she saw was someone who needed help. What happened next changed everything. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves, you don't forget to subscribe. The rain hadn't stopped since dawn. A steady whisper against the windows of the tiny diner tucked at the far edge of a quiet Oregon town. The Riverside Cafe sat wedged between a bait shop and an antique bookstore. No one had been inside for years. From the outside, it didn't look like much chipped green paint, a flickering neon open sign, but inside, it pulsed with the chaos of a lunch rush already in full swing. Tasha Melrose, 29, moved like a current through the storm of it all. Her sneakers squeaked on the damp linoleum, apron dusted with flour and something that might have been coffee or maybe soup she'd lost track an hour ago. She didn't complain. She never did. Booth 4 was waving for more ketchup. The register was backed up. A baby was screaming somewhere near the back, and the printer in the kitchen kept spitting out new tickets like it had a grudge against her. Still, she smiled, or at least, she tried to. Behind the counter stood Clayton Griggs, the manager, arms crossed, eyes narrow, his presence as warm as a cold draft. Clayton had a way of showing up just when you didn't need him, always watching, always ready to remind you that he was the one keeping the lights on. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. His words were sharp, delivered low and slow, like a knife dragged across a plate. "Tasha," he called, not looking up from the clipboard in his hand. Table nines still waiting on their check. "You planning to serve people or just decorate the place? I got it," she said, already on the move. "Then move faster." She bit her tongue. No point answering back. Not here, not today. She dropped the check at table 9 with an apology, grabbed the mop to clean up a spill near the soda machine, and barely dodged a tray being swung by Lily, the teenage part-timer who looked seconds from tears. "You okay?" Tasha asked under her breath as she passed. "I'm trying," Lily whispered. "You're doing fine. Just breathe." It wasn't the kind of job that got noticed. No one left glowing reviews about the waitress who remembered their coffee order or brought extra napkins without being asked. But Tasha kept showing up, shift after shift, like the world would fall apart if she didn't. Maybe in her own way. She believed it might. Outside, the rain thickened. Cars passed in a blur, tires hissing against wet pavement. Inside, the clatter of forks and the buzz of conversation blurred into background noise. But beneath it all, there was a tension, subtle, quiet, like something waiting at the edge of the frame. She didn't know it yet, but today wouldn't end like the others. As she turned toward the kitchen, hands full of empty coffee cups, she caught sight of something or someone through the fogged-up glass near the entrance. Just a silhouette at first. A man, standing still, shoulders slightly slouched. No umbrella, no coat buttoned. Just standing, watching. Tasha blinked. The door hadn't opened. Not yet, but something about the way he stood there made her pause. Clayton barked again. "Let's go! Melrose! We running a charity or a restaurant?" She didn't answer. Not because she was ignoring him, but because, for just a second, she wasn't entirely sure which one it was. The bell above the cafe door didn't ring when he stepped inside. Maybe it had jammed from the humidity, or maybe no one noticed the sound under the clatter of silverware and the endless grind of the espresso machine. But he was there, just inside the threshold, soaked from the rain and still as a photograph. His jacket, old leather, darkened by weather and time, clung to his shoulders like a story no one had asked to hear. A beat-up canvas hat sat low over his silver hair, and in his hands, he held what looked like a folded map, creased, wet, and barely holding itself together. Tasha spotted him from behind the drink station. There was something about the way he stood intent, but lost, like a man who'd walked into the past without meaning to. She watched him for a second, hoping Clayton wouldn't, then slid past a tray of dirty plates and approached slowly, like she might spook him if she moved too fast. "Sir," she said gently, not too loud. "Are you all right?" He looked up, eyes pale, distant, but kind. He seemed to study her for a moment, as if trying to place her face in some timeline she didn't belong to. Then he glanced down at the map in his hand, rain having smudged most of the ink into soft rivers of blue and red. "I was looking for a place," he said, voice low and rough, like someone who hadn't spoken much lately. "Thought it was here, but I'm not sure anymore." She didn't press. People like him, men carrying time the way others carry baggage, didn't need to be rushed. Instead, she gestured toward an empty booth near the window. "Why don't you sit down? Get warm," she said. "I'll bring you something. Coffee, okay?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "That'd be fine." He moved with a quiet grace. Not fast, not frail, but measured. The kind of movement that came from someone used to walking unfamiliar ground. As he slid into the booth, his jacket opened slightly, revealing a worn chain around his neck. A dog tag, faded and nicked with age, peeked out against his shirt. Tasha caught the glint of it before looking away. She grabbed a coffee pot and poured him a cup, then returned to the counter and pulled out a 10 from her apron pocket, her own tip money. Clayton's no freebies rule was printed on the backroom wall like scripture. But some rules were made to be ignored. "Louise," she called into the kitchen window, "can I get one meatloaf? Mashed, green beans, extra gravy." Louise didn't question it. He just gave a half nod and turned to the stove. He'd worked with Tasha long enough to know she never asked for something without a reason. She brought the plate out herself, set it down gently, added a warm roll and a packet of butter, then filled his water glass with lemon, even though he hadn't asked. He looked at the meal like it might vanish if he blinked too fast. "You didn't have to," he said, eyes never leaving the steam rising from the mashed potatoes. "Yeah," Tasha replied softly. "I kinda did." He smiled then. Not a big smile, just a flicker, like something that hadn't been used in a while was still working. She turned to walk away, but couldn't help glancing back once. He had unfolded the map again, pressing it flat against the table with one hand, while he reached for a fork with the other. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the diner went on, unaware. But something had shifted, if only slightly. Something about the man, his silence, his presence. He didn't ask for attention, didn't tell stories, didn't explain who he was. But there was a weight to him, a gravity. Tasha didn't know his name, didn't need to. Not yet. All she knew was that sometimes people walk into your life and change the temperature of the room without saying a word. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she had a feeling he wasn't just passing through. The lunch rush didn't let up. If anything, it got worse. Plates stacked up at the pass window like a game no one was winning. Receipts curling from the register like toilet paper caught in a fan. And Clayton's voice cut through it all like a bad alarm clock, sharp, repetitive, and impossible to ignore. Tasha wiped down booth 7, half listening to the complaints at table 3 about a missing side salad. She offered an apology, tossed in a free refill, and smiled even though her jaw hurt from doing it all day. From the corner of her eye, she could still see him quiet, eating slowly, like every bite was a memory he didn't want to disturb. The man with the weathered face and the old leather jacket hadn't said much since she served him, but he hadn't left either. The map was gone now, folded neatly beside his plate, and his dog tag chain had slipped back under his collar. He sipped his water like someone who didn't expect anyone to care whether he drank it or not. She was heading toward the kitchen, bus tub balanced on one hip. When it happened, Clayton stepped out from behind the counter, clipboard in hand, scanning the room like he always did when things weren't falling apart fast enough for his liking. His eyes locked on the man in the booth, then on the plate of food, and finally on Tasha as she returned from the kitchen empty-handed. His voice didn't come loud at first. That was never his style. It came low and steady, the kind of tone that made you feel like trouble had arrived without knocking. "Melrose," he said, eyes narrowing. "Want to explain why Booth 12 is eating meatloaf without a ticket?" Tasha froze. She glanced at the man, who looked up briefly before returning to his meal. Then back at Clayton, whose mouth already curled into something cruel. "I paid for it," she said. "Out of my tips." "That's not how this works," Clayton snapped. "You think you get to decide who eats for free?" "I didn't give it away," she replied, voice still even. "I paid—" Louise rang it in. "Doesn't matter," he barked. "It's about policy. It's about procedure. You want to run a soup kitchen. Do it on your own time." A few nearby tables had gone quiet. A woman near the register turned halfway in her seat. Even the clatter in the kitchen slowed. He looked hungry. Tasha said, "He wasn't bothering anyone. I had the money. It didn't cost the cafe a dime." Clayton stepped closer, voice still low but slicing now. "That's not the point. Melrose, you made a decision without me. You broke chain of command." "It's not a war zone," she said, regretting the words the second they left her mouth. His eyes lit up with the opening, then stopped acting like a hero. And then he did what Tasha feared most. He turned to the room, raised his voice, and invited everyone into the humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, arms wide, sarcasm dripping, "if anyone's hungry and short on cash, don't worry. Tasha, here's running a charity out of booth 12. Someone chuckled awkwardly. A fork clinked against a plate and didn't move again. "She'll cover it," Clayton went on. "She's got the tips for it, apparently." Tasha stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. Her ears burned. The man in the booth looked up slowly, eyes narrowing just slightly. Not at her, but at Clayton. He didn't say a word, just watched. "Take off the apron," Clayton said, stepping back now, voice dropping again. "You're done. And if I catch you on this floor again, I'll have security escort you out." The cafe wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't anything. Just still, like it was holding its breath. Tasha didn't cry. Not yet. She didn't give him that. She untied the apron slowly, folded it, and placed it on the edge of the counter. "Louise?" Clayton barked toward the kitchen. "You hear this?" A pause. Then a quiet voice from behind the stainless steel. "I heard," Louise said. "Doesn't mean I agree." Clayton ignored him. He was already too deep in the theater of it, already convinced he'd made a point. Tasha turned, not looking at anyone in particular, and walked past the booth where the old man still sat. She met his eyes for a second, tried to smile. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but he shook his head, just once, slow and steady. His eyes weren't cloudy anymore. They were sharp, focused, watching. As she pushed the door open and stepped into the misty gray of afternoon, the bell above it finally rang. And back inside, the man who hadn't spoken more than a sentence all day gently placed his fork down, folded the napkin beside his plate, and reached into his coat. Not for money, not yet, but for something else entirely. The rain had shifted from a drizzle to a steady rhythm by the time Tasha reached the bus stop. Her hoodie clung to her shoulders, not doing much to keep her dry, and her apron, still neatly folded, was cradled in her arms like something fragile, something that still held weight even after it had been stripped of meaning. She didn't sit. She didn't move much at all, just stood there, watching the road through the misted veil of water and headlights, trying not to feel like the entire world had quietly agreed she didn't belong anymore. Back inside the cafe, no one spoke. The bell above the door had stopped ringing. Clayton returned behind the counter, tapping at the receipt printer like nothing had happened. Lily, still holding a half-full drink tray, stared at the spot where Tasha had stood just moments earlier. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something, but then she didn't. She turned back toward the drink station instead, head low, shoulders tight. Louise peeked through the kitchen window. His apron was dusted with flour and frustration. He opened his mouth, closed it again, Then he wiped his hands on a towel and turned back to the stove. The man in booth 12 had not touched another bite of food. He sat motionless, his hands resting on the table, fingers curled slightly as if still holding something invisible. His eyes drifted toward the door Tasha had walked through, then down to the folded napkin beside his plate. No one asked who he was. No one offered him the check. Clayton didn't speak to him, didn't even glance in his direction. The old man could have vanished right then, and maybe no one would have noticed. But he didn't vanish. Instead, he reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small flip phone. Not the kind with apps or cameras, just plastic and buttons and time. He opened it with a quiet snap and pressed a number that had long since worn the number pad down to a smudge. A moment passed, then another, and then a soft voice on the other end answered. The man cleared his throat. "I don't mean to cause trouble," he said quietly, "but there's a girl. She gave me a hot meal, said it was no big deal. Her manager didn't like that. Fired her, right in front of everyone." He paused. "She didn't know who I was. That's the part that matters." Another pause. "I just thought someone ought to know." He closed the phone with a soft click, then slid it back into his coat. He didn't look around. He didn't speak again. Just sat there, staring out the rain-streaked window as the world around him returned to its usual rhythm, oblivious to the call that had already set something else in motion. The cafe hadn't quite returned to normal. Clayton tried to make it so, calling out orders, adjusting napkin dispensers, barking at Lily when she took too long at the drink station. But there was a static in the air now, something off. A few regulars shifted uncomfortably in their booths. A couple near the window whispered to each other over half-finished pancakes. And in the corner, still sitting quietly in booth 12, the old man hadn't moved except to gently place a dollar bill under his water glass. Reggie, a retired firefighter who came in every Wednesday for the biscuits and gravy, squinted from his stool at the counter. He tilted his head slowly, eyes narrowing, then glanced again at the man in the booth. He rubbed his chin, leaned toward the woman sitting beside him, and said just loud enough for her to hear, "I swear, I think that guy once pulled me out of a crash site in Wyoming. It was years ago. Plane went down in the Tetons. Pilot flew in solo. Never gave a name." The woman glanced toward the booth, then back at Reggie. "You sure know," he said. "But I remember the face. He had the same jacket, same quiet." The words hung in the air just long enough for someone else to pick them up. A barista at the register overheard, then leaned over and whispered the rumor to Lily. Lily, wide-eyed, glanced toward the booth, then back at Clayton, who was too busy pretending not to care, to notice the slow ripple spreading through his dining room. Another customer, a middle-aged man with a laptop and a sharp memory, tapped something into his browser. He studied a grainy photo, then another. He lifted his eyes, looked toward the booth, then whispered to no one in particular. "That can't be." The man in the booth didn't shift, didn't speak, just stirred his coffee gently, as if unaware that his presence had begun to unravel the fabric of this place. Then the door opened. This time, the bell rang once, twice, loud and sharp, and 4 men stepped in from the rain. Not customers, not locals. They were dressed in dark jackets, boots that had walked through more than rain, and shoulders that carried the weight of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. They weren't in full uniform, but there was no mistaking what they were. Marines. They didn't order food, didn't glance at the menu. The tallest of them scanned the room until his eyes landed on the man in booth 12. The old man finally looked up. He nodded once, slow and measured, and the Marine gave the same nod back. Now, Clayton noticed. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, one stepping out from behind the counter. Trying on a smile that didn't quite fit, the first Marine took a step forward. "We came to check on someone." Clayton blinked. "Right. Well, this is a private business. So unless you're here for a meal, we're here," the Marine interrupted, "because someone we trust said something happened that shouldn't have." He turned his head slightly toward booth 12. "Said a young woman gave him a warm meal without knowing who he was, and then got fired for it." Clayton's smile twitched. This is all getting blown out of proportion? She broke policy. I don't care who he is. The Marine's voice stayed calm. That's the problem. You didn't care. A soft murmur moved through the cafe. Reggie stood from his stool. You know who he is, don't you? He said, pointing toward the booth. Clayton followed the line of sight, but before he could speak, another Marine answered. His name is Harrison Ford, he said. He flew rescue missions in mountain terrain most pilots wouldn't touch. Saved lives, volunteered time, kept his name out of the headlines. And today, he sat quietly while someone showed him kindness just because he looked like he needed it. Lily gasped. One of the baristas dropped a spoon, but the old man Harrison didn't flinch. He just nodded gently, then turned toward Clayton. She didn't ask for anything. He said, voice quiet but steady. Didn't know me. Didn't care. She just saw someone who looked like they needed help. And she helped. Clayton tried to recover. Look, I didn't know that's the point, said the first Marine. She didn't either, but she did the right thing anyway. It wasn't about the name now. Not really. The power in the room didn't come from celebrity. It came from conviction. And the only man not speaking, the one who could have turned the whole cafe upside down with a single sentence, had chosen instead to let others say what needed to be said. Because sometimes it's not about who you are. It's about who shows up when it matters and who remembers. The Marines didn't speak all at once. They didn't need to. Just by standing there calm, steady, unmoved by the clinking dishes or Clayton's forced smile, they had shifted the weight of the room. There was something about them, the way they carried themselves. Like justice wasn't something they chased, but something they brought with them wherever they went. And it was clear to everyone now watching in silence that they hadn't come here for coffee. Clayton tried again, clearing his throat. So, you all know this man. The tallest Marine looked over at the booth where Harrison Ford still sat, hands resting gently on the table like nothing urgent was happening. Then he turned back toward Clayton. We know him, not from red carpets or movie posters. We know him as Harrison, our flight instructor. A man who taught search and rescue when no one else would fly in storms. A man who landed on ridges most people can't even hike. That's the man sitting in that booth. Clayton blinked, clearly thrown. I didn't recognize him. You weren't supposed to, another Marine said, stepping forward now, lower voice and sharper edge. He's never asked to be recognized. But that girl, Tasha, she treated him like a human being when no one else did. Not because of who he was, because of who she was. A pause took the room. Then Reggie, the retired firefighter, stepped forward again, nodding. I didn't know who he was either, but I know who she is. That girl's been refilling my cup for 3 years. Always remembers how I like it, one sugar, no cream, never once got it wrong. That matters to some of us. A woman near the window stood up. Her name was Cheryl, owner of the hair salon next door. Tasha walked one of my employees to her car every night for weeks after we had a break-in. Didn't ask, didn't brag, just did it because she thought someone should. Clayton was starting to look boxed in, his grip on authority slipping like a frayed rope. Okay, I get it, he said quickly, holding up his hands. But this is still a business. I have rule. She broke one. What was I supposed to do? Have a conversation. The Marine with the sharp jaw said, ask why, ask how, not turn it into a performance in front of strangers. You think she's a saint? Clayton asked, his voice rising. She gave away a plate of food. It wasn't some act of heroism. No, the first Marine said, but she gave dignity, and around here, that still means something. Lily stepped forward now, shaky but determined. She helped me fix my brakes, she said, voice small but clear. Didn't tell anyone. Paid for the parts. I didn't ask. She just saw me panicking in the parking lot and said, you need help. That's it. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the soda machine behind the counter. Clayton opened his mouth to speak again, But another voice cut him off. Louise, the cook, had stepped out from the kitchen, apron gone, arms crossed over his chest. "You've been running this place like people are lucky just to be here," he said. "But it's Tasha who kept it running. You think customers come for your laminated menus and passive-aggressive signs in the break room. They come because she made this place feel human. Someone clapped, just one person at first, then another. It wasn't thunderous or theatrical, just honest, steady, the kind of applause that comes from people finally waking up to something they should have seen long ago." Clayton turned red. "So now what? You're all turning against me?" "No," the Marine said calmly. "We're standing up for someone. That's different." A young man in a hoodie stood from his stool at the counter. He didn't speak at first, just pulled out his wallet and placed a 20 on the counter. "For her," he said, "and for that meal." That was the crack, the break in the dam. One by one, people began reaching into their wallets. No one asked them to, no one organized it, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This was about right and wrong. More than a dozen bills were left on tables. Notes scribbled on napkins. For the girl with the good heart. "Thank you, Tasha. Keep going." Clayton stood stiffly behind the register, jaw tight, unable to say much of anything now. Power had left his hands and settled somewhere else, somewhere quieter, deeper, somewhere near the booth where Harrison still sat, watching it all unfold without a word. Finally, one of the Marines turned back to him. "You still don't get it, do you?" he asked. Clayton narrowed his eyes. "What's there to get you fired the wrong person?" he said. "And it's not because of who she helped. It's because you forgot who keeps places like this alive." Outside, the rain had slowed to a hush. The sky was still gray, but the streetlights had begun to flicker on. And in that little cafe on the edge of town, something had shifted forever. Not because a celebrity walked through the door, but because one woman had done something decent. And everyone else finally found the courage to admit they'd needed to see it. Harrison didn't stand yet. He didn't need to. His presence had already done what it came to do. And maybe that was the point. He hadn't come to be defended. He'd come to make sure she wasn't alone. The offer came 2 days later, buried between junk emails and a newsletter she didn't remember subscribing to. At first, Tasha thought it was spam. The subject line was too neat, too polite opportunity to serve, if you're still willing. But the sender's address was real, and the name Jordan Malik, Director of Flight Volunteer Services, carried a quiet authority. She clicked it open with hesitation, sitting on the edge of her narrow couch, legs tucked under her, fingers still slightly damp from doing dishes. The message wasn't long. Jordan explained he ran a volunteer-based rescue support center just north of town. Their team worked with retired pilots, first responders, and trained civilians to help locate lost hikers, supply aid to remote communities, and support local wildfire evacuations. The kind of work that didn't show up in headlines, but saved lives all the same. He wrote, "We recently heard about what happened at Riverside. One of our founding sponsors told us the full story, not just about what you did, but how you did it, quietly, decently, without asking for anything in return. And then, near the bottom of the email, came the part that made her sit still for a full minute. Mr. Ford rarely speaks at length, but after that day, he said something we haven't heard from him in a long time. He said, 'She reminded me why I flew in the first place.'" She read the line again, then again. There was a phone number. No pressure, no urgency, just a suggestion to call if she wanted to talk. She did. That same night, Jordan's voice was warm and steady. He didn't talk about fame or video clips or what had gone viral. He asked if she was okay, asked what kind of work she wanted to do, said there was an open position on the operations team coordinating flight runs, dispatching supplies, greeting walk-ins, helping with records. "We're not fancy," he said, "but we're real, and we could use someone like you." Tasha accepted before she had time to second-guess it. On her first day, the sun broke through for the first time in a week. She took the early bus out past the hills, her apron folded in her bag not as armor, but as memory. The center sat on a converted airfield, small and weathered, with a row of modest hangars and an office that smelled faintly of coffee and old maps. The desk where she'd be working had a window that faced the runway. Taped beside it was a photo, grainy, black and white. A much younger Harrison Ford standing next to a tiny single-engine plane, helmet under one arm, smile half-formed. No fanfare, no signature, but on the bottom corner of the photo, someone had scribbled a note in Sharpie. "You never know who you're helping. Just help anyway." Tasha ran her fingers across the edge of the frame. Then she sat down, exhaled slowly, and got to work. The sun was beginning to fall behind the trees when Tasha locked up the file cabinet. It had been a quiet Saturday at the center, just a few walk-ins, one supply run scheduled for the next morning, and a fresh stack of paperwork she'd finally managed to sort. The office lights cast a soft amber glow across the walls, and the only sound was the hum of the printer cooling down. She turned to grab her bag when she saw an envelope on the edge of her desk that hadn't been there an hour ago. No name, no return address, just thick paper, slightly creased, like it had been carried in a pocket for a long time. She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of old navigation paper, the kind pilots used before GPS. Faded ink marked a mountain ridge somewhere in the Cascades. In one corner, drawn in pencil, was a small X with a note beside it. First landing, June 1989. Beneath it, in handwriting neat but worn, just one line. "The ones who help quietly are the ones who keep the world standing." She didn't cry, but she sat down for a moment, fingers still resting on the edge of the map, eyes fixed on the ink like it held more than memory. Later, they checked the security footage out of curiosity. The motion camera near the front door had picked up a single figure around 3:17 p.m. He didn't come inside. Just stepped up to the glass, placed the envelope through the slot, then turned and walked away. The footage was grainy, the angle wrong, but you could make out the familiar outline of a worn leather jacket, the curve of a canvas flight cap, the slow gait of someone who'd carried more years than regrets. No one asked questions. No one needed to. And that was the point. He didn't want to be thanked. She didn't need a stage. Kindness, when real, doesn't demand recognition. It just leaves something behind, like a folded map, or a memory, or a better world than the one it found. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.